Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Britain Archives. In today's video, we will look into Bartley Gorman, the boxing king, who was ambushed at around 10:30 in the morning. Gorman arrived to face Ricky Top Hat Donahue, but the man who was supposed to appear was not there. The atmosphere around the meeting point went quiet too quickly. Voices dropped. A few eyes moved towards the outer edge, and the space in front of Gorman no longer felt like the build-up to a fight. Then the group came out, according to the recorded information. More than 25 men appeared with crowbars and bricks. They rushed in, turning the meeting into an armed attack. Gorman was beaten unconscious. Afterwards, he remembered very little about what had happened. The title King of the Gypsies is often mentioned around Gorman as a sign of his position in the bare-knuckle world, but that morning showed the other side of reputation. So what happened that morning? Why did Ricky Top Hat Donahue not appear at the meeting point, while Bartley Gorman was left facing more than 25 men carrying crowbars and bricks? To understand that ambush, we have to go back into the world of bare-knuckle fighting, where reputation did not only bring people to watch, but sometimes brought men who wanted to bring a name down. Let us begin. In Bartley Gorman's story, bare-knuckle fighting sat outside mainstream boxing in Britain. These fights did not use gloves or clear licenses. They also did not pass through the same system of control as professional boxing, where there were licensing boards, recognized referees, and specific rules of organization. The transcript mentions encounters at horse fairs, campsites, bars, parties, streets, dumps, and mine shafts. These were temporary meeting points, crowded places, full of shouting, where the result was then carried on through word of mouth. This detail needs to be placed within the right limits. A few fights in the source material cannot represent the whole traveler community. Here, bare-knuckle fighting is described as part of honor, dispute, and reputation within certain groups. That world still had unwritten rules. A man who had gone down was often seen as having reached the end of his turn, and the crowd played the role of witness, but it also existed in a gray area, where betting money, pride, and fear stood close together before a name began to spread beyond it. Bartley Gorman is introduced in the transcript first through a name, rather than through an official boxing record. He was born on 1 March 1944, the son of Samuel and Katie Gorman. The video says his parents did not like fighting, a detail that makes Bartley's position more complicated. Outside the family, the Gorman name became tied to stories of fists, challenges, and reputation in bare-knuckle fights. The title King of the Gypsies therefore needs to be placed in the right context. It belongs to oral accounts, fighting culture, and the way people spoke about him around unlicensed fights. That title is different from one awarded by the boxing system in Britain. For that reason, Bartley should not be built into an unbeatable figure. The more accurate way to see him is as one of the well-known bare-knuckle fighters mentioned in the transcript within the traveler community. His name passed through memoirs, word of mouth, unofficial meeting points, and the memories of people who many years later had once stood watching as the circle closed before a fight. Before Bartley Gorman created his own position, the Bartley name already carried weight in the bare-knuckle world. According to the transcript, Gorman saw himself as the heir to an old fighting line. His great-grandfather was nicknamed Boxing Bartley, Ireland's king of the tinkers in the 19th century. His grandfather was known as Bulldog Bartley, a bare-knuckle boxer described as unbeaten. Those titles did not sit inside official sporting records. They existed through family stories, word passed between traveler groups, and memories of unlicensed fights. For Gorman, that legacy created its own pressure. When a name has traveled ahead of you for generations, every time you step into a waiting circle, it carries extra meaning. The crowd is not only looking at the hands, they are looking at the surname behind them, at the stories already told, and at the question of whether Bartley can carry that weight. A fight may end after a few minutes, but judgment often stays longer. For Gorman, fighting was not simply a personal choice. It was family legacy, the expectation of those around him, and the shadow he had to carry before building his own reputation. Bartley Gorman's youth, as described in the transcript, is placed under the weight of a surname that already had a fighting history, according to the press accounts repeated in the video. Gorman is said to have had his first bare-knuckle fight when he was only 12 years old. This detail needs to be understood as an account, rather than as a firm line in an official record. It appears to show that violence had entered the story of Bartley very early, before he was old enough to fully understand the cost of reputation. A boy growing up with names such as Boxing Bartley and Bulldog Bartley would hear more than ordinary family stories. Each time the older fights were repeated by adults, the Gorman name became a little heavier. Those stories were not only about strength, they created a measure. In that world, children could learn early that reputation did not sit on paper. It sat in the way other people looked at you when you entered a crowd, in the calling of your name before a confrontation, and in the pressure to prove that you had not weakened the surname behind you. For Bartley, the transcript describes youth as a period in which violence came too close too soon. The first fight at the age of 12, if the account is accurate, was a sign that he had been pulled into the fighting circle while still very young. The abandoned quarry was the place where Bartley Gorman's reputation moved into another stage. The opposing source records that when he met Jack Fletcher, Gorman was 28 years old. 6 feet 1 in tall, and weighed 15.5 stone. The location mentioned was not an arena with numbered seats or controlled entrances. It was an abandoned quarry, with rough ground underfoot, rock faces behind them, and the crowd pulling itself closer so it could see the two men in the middle. There was no introduction over a stadium speaker. The onlookers stood in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on every punch. Those at the front could see the faces, the hands, and the distance closing between the two men. Those behind could only hear the shouting, the sound of feet scraping against the ground, and then read the reaction of the circle to know which side was beginning to move forward. In the bare-knuckle world described by the video, Gorman defeated Jack Fletcher and was then spoken of as the bare-knuckle champion of Great Britain and Ireland. That description needs to be understood in its proper context. It was not the same as a boxing title licensed by the official sporting system in Britain. It lived through those who witnessed it, through the stories told after the fight, and through the people present accepting the result. For Bartley, that fight separated him from the shadow of his family. Before then, his name had stood alongside Boxing Bartley and Bulldog Bartley. After the quarry, his reputation began to carry its own weight. An abandoned patch of ground, a circle closing in, an opponent going down, and then the Gorman name being carried differently through later stories of fighting on the margins of Britain. In Bartley Gorman's life, the fights often took place far away from licensed boxing rings. The opposing video lists rough and scattered locations, mine shafts, dumps, horse fairs, campsites, bars, parties, and streets. Each place suggests a different kind of atmosphere. At a horse fair, passers-by might stop, the sound of buying and selling mixing with names being called out. At a campsite after dark, light from the caravans fell across the ground. A few people watched the outer edge, and those closest formed a space in the middle. In a bar, a conversation could suddenly stop when two men stood up. Glasses remained on the tables, chairs were pushed back, and eyes across the room turned in the same direction. At a party, the sound of enjoyment could drop very quickly when someone understood that what was about to happen was no longer just words being exchanged. On the street, no notice board was needed. It only took enough people knowing each other's names, enough tension, and an opening in the walkway. A mine shaft or a dump pulled the story even lower. Bad ground, the smell of dust, rubbish, old metal, and places that had never been built for sport. Those locations are part of what made bare-knuckle fighting in Gorman's life different from mainstream boxing. It lived through the presence of witnesses, through the stories told after the fight, and through the groups who had already heard his name. Gorman did not hold his title through a license. He held it by appearing at meeting points where others came to test him. Each time he stepped into the middle, his name was weighed through watching eyes, shouting voices, and the story that spread afterwards. St. Leger Day in 1976 took Bartley Gorman's story in a different direction. The meeting was set up as a confrontation with Ricky Top Hat Donahue. Gorman arrived at around 10:30 in the morning, ready for a fight that many people had been waiting to see. But the man he was meant to face was not there. The atmosphere around the place was unusually quiet. Voices dropped. A space opened up, and the silence became the first sign that everything had moved away from the original arrangement. Then 25 men appeared. They did not come in like spectators. In their hands were crowbars and bricks. In that moment, what was meant to be a confrontation turned into an ambush. Gorman was beaten badly, went down, lost consciousness, and afterwards remembered very little about what happened next. The opposing source says the attacking group was alleged to have been paid $25,000 to do it, but who stood behind that money is not clear. For that reason, this detail should be understood only as an allegation within the account, not as a firm conclusion. St. Leger Day showed the darker side of reputation in the bare-knuckle world. When a name was seen as carrying too much weight, not everyone wanted to test it in front of a crowd under unwritten rules. Some chose another way, more men, weapons, and a strike before the fight could even begin. For Gorman, that morning did not add another victory. It left a scar in the story of the title he carried, before the people who had come to witness it that day. The story with David Pearce brought Bartley Gorman close to the line between bare-knuckle fighting and mainstream boxing. By then, Pearce had drawn attention after his knockout of John Tate, the former WBA heavyweight champion, in California. From that point, the opposing video says Gorman and Pearce agreed to meet in a fight described as the World Unlicensed Championship. This was still a world outside official licensing, but Pearce's name brought it close to recognized boxing. Gorman is quoted as saying that Pearce was the best fighting man in Britain, while he was the king of the Gypsies. If he won, he wanted to challenge Muhammad Ali. That statement showed an ambition that reached beyond the circle at horse fairs or campsites. For Gorman, reputation in bare-knuckle fighting was not enough. He wanted to pull his name towards a place where mainstream boxing would be forced to see it, even though that door was never easy to open. But the plan stopped before the fight could take shape. The transcript says Pearce was threatened with a worldwide ban if he took part. The source names the BBC, but this detail should be handled carefully, because in a boxing context it may have related to a governing body rather than a television broadcaster. What remained was a fight that never happened, a challenge that never reached Muhammad Ali. and a clear sign of the distance between reputation on the margins and the boxing system in Britain. Muhammad Ali appears in Bartley Gorman's story as a point of reference, rather than as proof of his position in boxing. For a man who lived in bare-knuckle fighting, Ali represented the world Gorman could hardly reach. The major ring, global fame, recognized rules in the eyes of sport. There are accounts that Ali knew Bartley Gorman, that they had met, sparred, and that Ali had praised his technique. These details need to be kept in proportion. They belong to later accounts and should not be turned into a firm statement that Ali recognized Gorman within the boxing world. What matters more is the way reputation traveled. Bartley's name did not only move around horse fairs, campsites, or bare-knuckle meeting points. According to some accounts, it traveled far enough to be placed beside Muhammad Ali in stories about fighting. But the distance remained. Ali belonged to boxing recorded in sporting history. Gorman belonged to another world, where reputation lived through witnesses and memories passed on afterwards. In his later years, Bartley Gorman's story moved from the circle of fight watchers to the page in the documentary lens. The 210-page autobiography King of the Gypsies was completed before his death in 2001 with the help of Peter Walsh. In it, Gorman recounts a very early memory. When he was only 9 years old, he saw his uncle killed by a punch from a showman. This detail should be kept as an account from the autobiography, but it shows that violence had entered his life long before the titles that came later. Peter Walsh described Gorman as a man with a sense of humor, but also with a feeling of melancholy. Those two traits sit quietly beside each other. A man who could speak sharply, while still carrying a sadness that was not easy to name. In 1995, Shane Meadows made the short documentary King of the Gypsies, recording Gorman as he looked back over his life. After the fights, what remained was not only reputation, it was also memory, the body, and a violent past that stayed with him for a long time. The name Bartley Gorman finally returned to Uttoxeter, the opposing video records that he died at a traveler site in the town on 18 January 2002, after years in which he had been spoken about through fights, memoir, and documentary. The source also says his name appeared on Uttoxeter's Millennium Monument, alongside Staffordshire figures such as Joseph Bamford, the founder of JCB. That detail shows that Gorman did not disappear from local memory, but this ending does not need to place him as a clean symbol. He is remembered for the title, for the bare-knuckle fights, and for his position in the fighting stories of the traveler community. At the same time, violence followed him from very early on. The memory of his uncle, the abandoned quarry, the horse fair, the campsite, the bar, the street, and then Setleger Day 1976, where a fight arrangement turned into an ambush. Reputation keeps a person's name alive after death.